The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, thank you everyone for joining. This is Stefano De Clara from IETA. We'll wait 1 or 2 minutes for just to give you the chance to other people to join, and then we'll get started. So please bear with us for just 1 or 2 additional minutes. Thank you. Okay, let's get started then. And thank you everyone for joining this second Post COP23 webinar. We held the first one yesterday, well, in the afternoon European time and morning US time. And we'll hold the second one now in the morning EU time and afternoon Asia time. So before we get to the actual content, we'll go through a couple of housekeeping notes. So if we go to the next slide, we just want to highlight once again that we apply the same antitrust guidelines to this webinar as we do for all the other IETA meetings and gatherings and conference calls and webinars. So if any item or issue that conflicts with our antitrust guidelines will be raised during this webinar, either myself or David Hone and Jonathan Grant, the International Working Group co-chairs, will stop the meeting and assess whether we will continue or not. But I believe this will not be the case today. But yeah, it's good to remind everyone that we do have antitrust guidelines in place, and we take these really seriously. A second note of housekeeping is that all the participants are muted, and that's to avoid too much background noise on the line. So we will use the chat function to take your questions. So if you have questions or comments at any time during the presentation, please send them to us through the chat function, and we'll address those during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So let's move to the next slide. And so this is the agenda for today. We will walk you through what happened over the last year. So what happened between COP23 and sorry, between COP22 and COP23 in terms of of negotiations and discussion around the implementation of the Paris Agreement and more specifically on Article 6. Then we will provide a quick overview on what happened in Bonn over the 2 weeks of COP23. We will dig a bit deeper into what COP23 meant for the Article 6 discussion and how this was advanced. Then we will provide a bit of context regarding the way forward for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and we will quickly go through the timeline for 2018 and 2019 and the major milestones that we are expecting ahead of us. Then we'll talk a little bit about the IETA activities at COP23. And then we have 3 guest speakers for today's webinar. We have the David Hone and Jonathan Grant, the 2 international working group co-chairs, and Amy Steen from the UNFCCC Secretariat, who will provide their remarks on COP23. And then we will go into the Q&A session, where we will address any questions or comments you might have. So without any further ado, let's get started from the lead up to COP23, and well, our expectations as we got to the COP. So where we started from was in Marrakesh last year, where parties committed to deliver a rulebook to operationalize the Paris Agreement by COP24, so by the end of next year. And this meant that, well, the coming 2 years from after COP23 were expected to sort of like fully focus on advancing this work stream and making sure that everything was ready to deliver this rulebook by the end of next year. As such, we expected a mainly procedural COP. So we expected a COP that sort of like paved the way for all the necessary implementation work and advance the preparatory work that is needed to deliver the rulebook to operationalize every single item of the Paris Agreement, including Article 6, by next COP at the end of 2018 in Katowice. 2017 saw quite a lot of activities around the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and more specifically on Article 6. Parties met for the first time after COP22 in Marrakesh back in May for an intersessional session in Bonn. Before this session, they had the opportunity to submit a new round of submissions on sort of like their views for how our Article 6 of the Paris Agreement should be implemented. And then just before the start of the May intersessional, parties held 3 roundtables, one on each of the key elements of Article 6. So that they had one roundtable on ITMOs, one roundtable on the new emission mitigation mechanism, so Article 6.4, and one roundtable on non-market approaches, so Article 6.8. And those roundtables were aimed at having a different discussion compared to the usual negotiation sessions. So parties were able to sort of like sit around the table and present each other views on the implementation of Article 6, which means that they had a chance to have a more open and direct discussion on a number of key issues, and they were able to directly present their position and confront each other in a more open and informal way compared to the actual negotiations. Then, as we moved closer to COP23, we had the same process repeating again. So before COP23, we had a new round of submissions that were more detailed compared to the May ones, as they built already on the discussion that parties had in May, and were narrowed, focusing on more specific key issues. And parties also held 3 new roundtables over the weekend prior to the COP. And again, they had one roundtable on Article 6.2, so on ITMOs, one roundtable on Article 6.4, so the new emission mitigation mechanism, and one roundtable on Article 6.8, non-market approaches, which were, I think, really helpful to sort of like, they were really helpful for parties to understand each other's position and come to the actual negotiating session more prepared and more aware of what other parties wanted. In terms of what we wanted to see at COP23, our main priority was to see a draft negotiating text emerging at this session, because we saw this as a crucial step, which is necessary to make progress towards the development of the Article 6 implementation guidelines by next COP. So that was our main priority for this COP. And then again, as other priorities, we also wanted to have as much as possible our views, which are outlined in the IETA's straw proposal for Article 6, reflected in the actual negotiations process. So if you had the chance to have a look at our straw proposal, you'll find very detailed and clear views on how Article 6 should be implemented, and we advocated in the lead up to the COP, as well at this COP, to have those concepts reflected in the negotiations process. So if we move to the next slide and see and consider what happened over the 2 weeks, we saw that the main focus of this COP, as expected, was a continued work to operationalize the Paris Agreement and deliver the rule book for the operationalization of the Paris Agreement as a whole by next COP. So it was a very procedural COP, meaning that there were no major breakthroughs, but it was a COP focused on getting work done in the lead up to COP24. Different elements of the Paris Agreement are dealt in different bodies under the negotiations, and more specifically, Article 6 is dealt under SABSTA, the subsidiary body for scientific and technical advice, and other articles of interest. For example, Article 4 on NDCs and Article 13 on the transparency framework are instead dealt under the APA, which is the body responsible for making sure that all the elements of the Paris Agreement are ready to be implemented by the entry into force of the Paris Agreement and the application of the Paris Agreement, so by 2020. And a fair amount of progress was made across the board, meaning across all the different subsidiary bodies and all the constituted bodies towards the 2018 deadline. The main outcomes from Bonn were the Fiji momentum for implementation, which reaffirmed the commitment of having all the implementing details in place by the end of 2018, and the Talanoa dialogue, which further outlined how the Talanoa dialogue, which was formerly known as the facilitative dialogues, will work and will be structured. The facilitative dialogue will take place in 2018 in conjunction with the next COP, and will be sort of like a first version of the global stocktake in a way, which will instead take place 5 years after that, from 2023. And it's meant to be sort of like an assessment of where NDCs are at compared to the overall goal of the Paris Agreement, and also an assessment of what further action is needed to move towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. Moving on to cover what progress was made more specifically on Article 6. As I just said, we had a lot of work done before the COP. There were roundtable discussion and submissions by party, and that really helped parties to come prepared to this session with really clear views on what they on what other parties had on the table, sort of like discussion that could have with each other. The discussion as we move forward after COP22 is focusing more and more on substance and on detailed positions, as opposed to more high-level positions, as was the case at last year at COP22. This really led to a good amount of work to be delivered at this COP. So 12 informal notes were produced over the 2 weeks. 2 notes reflect three notes reflect the discussion that took place at the roundtables, and further 9 notes were instead used as notes to advance the discussion over the 2 weeks. When the process was kicked off on Mondays, the 2 co-facilitators of the Article 6 discussion presented a first version of these informal notes, which was meant to be a first outline of the for the structure of the eventual Article 6 implementation guidelines. And it presented a number of headers and proposed elements for how this discussion document, this implementing document should be structured. And then, as the discussion moved forward, and as parties sort of like outline what they were happy with and what they were unhappy with this first version of the document, the co-chairs progress these documents, and new iteration of the documents were released over the first week until all the parties were satisfied with the final outcome. And the final iteration of the 3 informal documents present one of the main outcomes from this COP regarding Article 6. The 3 informal documents cover each one of the main elements under Article 6. So again, ITMOs, the new emission mitigation mechanism, and non-market approaches. And they really detail the draft structure for the guidance document. After parties spent the first week sort of by trying to finalize this document, the discussion moved on to discussing the process and the way forward. And when that argument was covered, there started to be some tension in the room, and Amy will cover the reason for that a bit more in detail after I'm done. I will be done covering the COP outcomes. But then again, parties were able to decide on a final decision on how to take the discussion forward, which was a really meaningful one. So party decided to give mandate to the SEPSTA chair to draft a first informal version of the guidance document ahead of the next meeting, which will take place at the end of April and beginning of May 2018 in Bonn. This is particularly significant because that's what we as IETA wanted to see coming out from this session, and it means that 6 weeks before the next meeting, we will see for the first time since the Paris Agreement was implemented, since the Paris Agreement was agreed, we will see an actual draft text, which will be the first version of the final guidance that is needed to implement Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Moving forward, sorry, could we? Oh yeah. So this means that the timeline for 2018 and 2019 going forward will be structured in this way. So the Talanoia dialogue will be officially launched in January 2018, and we'll see a first phase structured around the intersessional in May 2018, and this will be a first sort of like preparatory phase. And then the Talanoia dialogue will move into what is defined as a political phase at the next COP. The main objectives of the Talanoia dialogue are to discuss 3 questions related to the implementation of the Paris Agreement and to the progression of NDCs. So it will tackle the questions of where we are now, where do we want to go in terms of the goals of the Paris Agreement, and more importantly, how do we get there? So what further actions are needed to close the gap between the current NDCs and the final and the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. As I just said, we will see the draft negotiating text for Article 6 released sometime in mid-May 2018, before the intersessional in May 2018. The Talanoia dialogue also has 2 deadlines for input. The first one of which is in early April. Then we'll go into the intersessional in April and May 2018, where the discussion on Article 6 will be further advanced based on this draft negotiating text. At SB 38, parties will also decide whether we will need a further negotiating session before the next COP, and this might take place sometime between June and November 2018, most likely between October and November 2018. But then again, the need for this additional session, as well as the exact timing of the session, will be discussed and agreed at SB 28 in May 2018. At the end of October, there will be a second deadline for input on to the Talanoia dialogue. Then COP24 will be held in Katowice, Poland, in early December 2018, and then the next step in the process is COP25, which will be held in November 2018, somewhere in the Latin America and Caribbean region. 2 options that were flagged over last COP were Brazil or Jamaica, but again, clarity on this will probably emerge at the next XB, or definitely by the next COP. If we move to the next slide, I just want to cover really briefly also what happened at the COP in terms of IETA activities. So again, this year IETA had a business hub that we sort of like were able to host thanks to sponsors and other partners, and allowed us to have a full program of side events over the 2 weeks. We had I think 5 or 6 IETA side events, and then we had a number of side events in collaboration with other partners, for a total of I think around 50 or 60 events over the 2 weeks. We also decided to bring forward an initiative that was launched for the first time in Paris, so which is the Carbon Pricing Award, that is organized together with the CMIA. And this year we awarded the New Zealand government in recognition of their work on the New Zealand Declaration, and we awarded the Pacific Alliance governments in recognition of the Cali Declaration, which is a declaration meant to sort of like pave the way for an establishment of an international carbon markets, or to sort of like promote discussion on carbon markets in Central and South America, and so we awarded the second award to Marcelo Mena, the Prime Minister, the environmental minister from Chile, and Enrique Lendo Fuentes from Semarnat, which are the 2 gentlemen in the top left corner, and in the bottom right corner you can see the first award that went to the New Zealand government and was collected by Kay Harrison, their lead market negotiator. In the bottom left corner, you can see a picture from the SEBSTA opening, and in the top right corner, that's a picture of the IETA AGM, and that's Dirk Forrister together with Minister McKenna from from Canada, and her part from Finland, I think. So two Minister of the Environment who came and sort of like said a quick congratulatory note at our AGM. Moving forward to the next slide, we have a few more pictures from the COP, but I would like to stop here and hand over the floor to Amy for her remark. So Amy, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Stefano. I hope everyone can hear me. Thanks for the opportunity to join you and just give a little bit more detail on what's been happening in the last few weeks. Stefano's really set out the procedural elements and actually what the work was that was done in the last couple of weeks very clearly. So I'm not going to repeat that. What instead I'm going to try to do is to try to get a bit more into the detail of what parties were discussing on particularly in relation to cooperative approaches, but also in relation to the central mechanism that is established by Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. And then I'm going to try and explain the kind of political dynamics of Article 6 as it is at the moment within the rest of the negotiation space for the Paris Agreement work programme, and how that will impact work going into 2018. So I think Stefano very clearly explained that that the parties and the Secretariat, we produced a lot of documents over the course of the last few weeks, and they're all available on the website. Particularly, there are presentations from parties from the roundtables. There's a summary of the roundtables in a kind of anonymized form. And there are 3 iterations of informal notes that will be used to develop draft options text going into the next phase of this work. But I think it's worth saying that it's not just for the sake of producing documents that the parties meet. Going through that process of engaging with each other brings them to understand each other's political and technical positions on how to implement what they agreed in Paris. And as the work evolves in its written form, what those notes now show is the areas where there is strong divergence between parties and where they disagree on ways to implement, and areas where there isn't such disagreement and an emerging consensus can be seen. And those of you that follow the UN climate change processes will know that consensus is very important because we don't have voting rules. So everybody has to be okay with what's coming through into the work and the way that things are elaborated. So that's 197 or so governments that need to all agree that this is the way to do things. So where you see divergence in discussions, these are things that will need to be negotiated during the course of next year in order to come to an understanding. And if we take cooperative approaches, which is a bit like bilateral trading between parties and maybe also sort of baseline and crediting systems that are overseen by the parties themselves, the real areas of convergence and divergence there are really becoming clear. The written product of this part of the Article 6 negotiations is really quite difficult to follow, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is that there are about 4 world views, as it were, on how this should be implemented. There is a group of parties that believe that, notwithstanding what the Paris Agreement says, the cooperative approaches should be overseen in a highly centralized multilateral fashion, and there should be an oversight body. There's no words that would indicate that in the Paris Agreement, but that doesn't mean that parties don't hold that view. I think it's important to recognize that that view is a fairly broadly held one, and the reason being that environmental integrity is very important to those parties. There's another worldview that comes across in the work that they've done this time, and that's that the only thing that needs to be regulated is around transfers of ITMOs, rather than around the cooperative approaches in which they operate. Now, Stefano was calling 6.2 ITMOs, and I think that goes to this view that many parties would say that the cooperative approaches are important, whereas others say only the ITMOs are important. And that is apparent in the divergences in the text, where there's a focus on the transfer or there's a focus on the identity and the role of the various parties. And so those are big divergences. In relation to more technical issues still, there's also a really good level now of understanding of different parties' positions. If we compare where parties are at as compared to just after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, there is a very significant amount of work done since Paris, and really we're right down to the nitty-gritty now where we need to be. So for example, in the document for cooperative approaches, you can see that there are options. Essentially they're called potential elements, but they're essentially options of how to actually do accounting under Article 6, and it's as specific as the various types of accounting: emissions based, target based, just an in and out based accounting. And that depth of technical work is where we needed to be at this point. And it's good to see that actually, despite May being a very difficult session for the parties, where many felt that there wasn't much progress, they actually did get something from the May session, and that the fruit of that work became apparent in November in the sessions we've just had. So those are, that's where parties are at. That document represents a substantive and political and technical discussion around the implementation. It's not just a record of what parties, of the words that parties like to see. In relation to the mechanism established by Article 6.4, if you were to look at the documents, you would see that document is much cleaner, much neater, and much better at flowing. And that simply reflects the fact that the UNFCCC as a whole has a better understanding of how to set up a body to oversee something, and how to set out in rule terms what that body should do and what activities it should approve. We have the CDM, we have JI, we have many other bodies under the UNFCCC process, all of which have been set up in a similar fashion. And so the logical flow of that work and that process means that parties are much more easily able to corral their thoughts into the written form. There again, we have many options. There is, of course, a debate around accounting for issued credits that come out of this mechanism. And that again reflects two different views. Some parties take the view that because this is a centrally issued mechanism where credits should be issued centrally, there is no accounting implication for that first part of the process, just like the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol. Whereas other parties say that because of the context of NDCs, with every party having an NDC, if you're hosting an activity, you do need to represent a transfer of a credit that comes from an activity in your country in some form of accounting process. Another issue in the mechanism is around CDM transition, and to a lesser extent the transition of JI activities, and that manifests itself in the discussions in many ways, but generally it's a fairly clear piece of discussion around transition, and explicitly so. And I think we're often asked what the outcome there will be, and I think that it's hard to imagine that something won't be transitionable, but at the same time it's also difficult to imagine that everything would be capable of being transitioned, just because a consensus model for negotiation means you move towards the middle ground. So those are kind of the nuances that are really prevalent now in the discussions around the mechanism and the cooperative approaches. In the wider political context, it was a very interesting session, because it became apparent that the fact that Article 6 is being negotiated in a technical rather than political body does impact the way it develops. The discussions this time in the political body, where many of the Paris Agreement work program work is located, were very difficult, and a number of key issues found it very difficult to actually write down where they were in terms of negotiation and what the current status was. In relation to NDCs themselves, there is a big piece of work that looks at how you account for NDCs, what NDC information should contain, and how NDCs should be expressed. And that agenda item was very challenging at this COP because it reflects a fundamental difference of views around NDCs. In relation to the transparency framework, which is the overall system within the Paris Agreement for reporting in progress on achieving Paris goals, again, there was a lot of documentation produced by the parties that shows that there's still a lot of work to do. So I think the crispness of the products of the parties at this session in Article 6 shows that we are getting right down to the technical detail, and political issues are now being expressed as technical options rather than still engaging at the political level. So that's just really the context. At this session, it seemed that being in the technical body really helped Article 6 to progress. Across 2018, balance across all Paris work programme items will need to be ensured. So it's maybe a small advantage for a temporary period, but it will mean that we get to a point early next year where, as Stefano said, there'll be texts to engage on. And that should be issued around the end of March sometime. The other thing that happened in the technical body that Article 6 is being negotiated in is that there is another issue within that body and in another body as well, where about response measures. And response measures is a subject area around helping countries that have to move away from an oil-based regime towards a different energy base, how to help those economies transition. And it was a very political issue. It's now much more technical, and it's much more broad than just oil economies now. But what we saw in the negotiations this time around was that we ended up with a trade between Article 6 and response measures. And that's largely because the countries that want to move fast in implementing Article 6 tend to be less interested in moving response measures at speed, and vice versa. The proponents and the real supporters of response measures tend to have concerns about the role of markets and slightly pull back on them. So it became a very transactional package in the negotiations this time around, and that has implications for next year. And the expediency of that package also makes Article 6 negotiations somewhat more complex, because those of you that follow the negotiations closely will know that Article 6 has three components. It has cooperative approaches, a central mechanism, and non-market approaches. And already within Article 6 discussions, there's an important balance between those items to make sure that all are receiving the same level of progress. So although coming out of this session, we're in a very good place in terms of technical work, the price for that perhaps is another layer of political bargaining around Article 6. Response measures in its own right also has to deliver to the end of 2018. So in that sense, the transactional relationship between the two as trade-offs for agreement may not be that negative. It may be useful. It does, however, reflect another changing dynamic in the negotiations, which is the reassertion of the strength of the like-minded group of developing countries, particularly China. And in Article 6, that manifested in that the deal that was brokered between Article 6 items and response measures was led by the LMDC in a discussion with the umbrella group, which is countries like Canada, Japan, the US, Norway, and the European Union. And that discussion excluded other countries like the African group and the small island states. So there's a need to make sure that the next session is more inclusive in terms of the decision-making process. And those of you that followed the later hours of the COP will know that it ran late because there was a concern that perhaps the African group were not getting what they were asking for sufficiently. So in other items. So I think we've really seen a really interesting session in terms of an incredibly constructive technical working environment, and the politics shifting to a higher level of bargaining around the whole package of work that has to be delivered by the end of next year. Just by having the technical progress, Article 6 will be in a very good place early next year, when in March, draft informal text will be issued from the substitute chair, and parties and stakeholders will be able to engage in understanding what that means. So I think I'll stop there, but I hope I've given you a sense of the politics within and around Article 6. Back to you, Stefano.
Thank you, Amy. And yeah, that was indeed really helpful to understand like what goes on behind the scene, especially for people that didn't have the chance to be in Bonn and follow the negotiations. I just want to quickly remind everyone to please send us questions through the either the chat function or the questions function, if you would like to ask anything to any one of the panelists. So without further ado, I would like now to give the floor Grant for their remarks.
Yeah, hi, Stefano, I'm clear to everybody?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Right, good. So it's David Hone here. We, as you know, we went into the Bonn meeting with our own straw proposal, and we shared this with the negotiating groups during the year, and then the updated version just prior to Bonn starting. And I think it's useful to reflect on the progress that's been made that Amy's talked about, and where it stands against our own straw proposal. I think in broad terms, for instance, if we left the whole negotiation to the umbrella group, we'd probably land quite close to where the IETA straw proposal is. But I think in the broader sense, looking at where some of the parties are, and Amy articulated that very well, there's still work to do. I think one particular area that I'd like to focus on in this is the idea of how Article 6 relates to NDCs. I think in the IETA proposal and in IETA's thinking, we very much see Article 6 as a cooperative measures to facilitate the implementation of NDCs. So by linking trading systems, by developing mechanisms that can trade units between NDCs and so on, we see that Article 6 can bring efficiency and cost minimization to the overall mitigation process, as we do with all these trading systems. But I think what is reflected to some extent from the views of some parties, and I think hopefully this isn't a view that is in the majority, and I don't think it is, that the ITMOs and particularly Article 6.4, the mechanism, sit above the NDCs, that they're additional to the actions taken under the NDCs, and that therefore they form another aspect of, and therefore that's how they enhance ambition. In particular, just reading, one of the comments that, or one of the pieces of text that's in the draft text that's come out, or in the elements of text, says an overall mitigation in global emissions take place when emission reductions are delivered at a level that goes beyond what would be achieved through the delivery of the host party's NDC and the acquiring party's NDC in aggregate and beyond offsetting. So this type of thinking, I think, it needs to be, we're going to have to work with that, we're going to have to challenge it a bit, and we're going to have to build understanding as to how mechanisms, how trading of carbon units actually enhance the ability to meet the NDCs and therefore feed into the overall strengthening of ambition rather than somehow sitting on top of where the NDCs are. So that's a real challenge for us. I think a second point is that I saw that a number of the comments made and the elements of text take the notion of additionality and enhanced ambition right down to every single action that takes place under Article 6, rather than looking at this from a more macro perspective. And what I mean by that is that if you imagine, for instance, the link that already exists between two trading systems, which is, California and Quebec, so there's two parties linked through part of their NDCs, that the notion of enhanced ambition comes from the fact that these two systems are joined and that they move in unison together and allow a more rapid progress and a more cost-effective progress. I think if you looked at every individual trade that took place or every individual transfer that took place between those two parties, you wouldn't see necessarily that enhanced ambition was a feature of it. Yet when you look at the whole, enhanced ambition is clearly one of their objectives through cost efficiency. And so I think one of the issues that we're going to have to deal with is the difference between why Article 6 is there in the macro perspective and whether every individual action within it has to meet a set of guidelines in terms of enhanced ambition and additionality. And so I think that's going to be that could potentially be a struggle next year. Anyway, that's just a couple of points. I think a lot of what is in the elements is good. A lot of the parties are thinking very much along the lines of IETA, but we are not there yet, and there's still work to do. So thanks very much.
Thank you, David. And let's go straight to Jonathan. Jonathan, we cannot hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, now it's perfect.
Sorry, I had both on mute. I just wanted to give 3 additional reflections. So the COP23 was previewed as a technical COP, and clearly there was some good progress made on the technical components of the rulebook. Perhaps, more progress than was expected going into it. But I do wonder if it was perhaps a missed opportunity, given that there was a small island state holding the presidency. The gap between the rhetoric around the global goal and the weakened national targets is huge, and that's something that the Talanoa dialogue should really start to address. The well below 2 degrees target in the Paris Agreement is hugely ambitious, and this will require a real step change in both pace and the timing of action if we're to achieve that. But looking at the outcome of the COP and the paper that was prepared by the presidency on the structure of the Talanoa dialogue that will take place next year, there the focus is still on global ambition and collective efforts, not the national ones. And there's really very little about the practicalities about how countries will start to scale ambition at the national level. Now, the timeframes are clearly very tight to achieve the well below 2 degrees goal. And my feeling is that countries will need to raise ambition at least by 2020, if that's to remain realistic. And there was very little indication that this would happen. I'm sure, Stefano, you can share the link to the Talanoa dialogue paper to give the members a chance to sort of have a look at how that process will be structured next year. My second reflection was that government negotiators referred to the gap between the negotiations process and the real economy. And they did it in a way that was quite unself-conscious. Clearly, there was a divide between the negotiations and the national pavilions and the sort of the NGO community. There was a physical divide between the bond zone and the Bula zone, and there was lots of action in the bond zone, which highlighted what's happening at the national level. But it was also evident that in the Bula zone, there were attempts to re-establish the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and to sort of try and reassert this division between developed and developing countries. And it struck me that it was interesting that there was clear recognition of the gap between where the negotiations are and this so-called real economy. And then my third and final point was just around the role that IETA played in bringing the bingo community together to respond to calls for business to be excluded from the talks on the basis of conflict of interest. This is something the business community took very seriously. And I think so far that issue has remained on the fringes. And I think it's even on the fringes among the environmental NGO community. But I think that IETA played an important role in corralling the business community around the messages of how business has a strong interest in the success of the talks. And I think many countries, particularly the umbrella group countries, expressed their support for the role that we play in the talks. So that was encouraging. So those are my three additional reflections on the talks. Back to you, Stefano.
Thank you. Thank you for your insights, Jonathan, and also thank you, David, for outlining sort of like how the current negotiations relate with our position and thinking at IETA. And thank you again, Amy, for your insights on the behind the scenes process too. I think that was really helpful. I would also thank everyone for joining the webinar today. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to get in touch by email. And if you would like to have a written recap of what was discussed today, or if you would like to have the links to the documents that we mentioned, or as Jonathan just mentioned, the link to the Talanoa dialogue document, don't hesitate to check our COP23 report, which was distributed to all members on Monday. Having said that, thank you again, everyone, for joining, and we'll keep you posted on the next steps.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Amy. Bye.
Thank you for inviting me. Bye-bye.